Thank you for choosing to watch this documentary. What we're going to be covering in it are some of the findings from research done into 3 different mysteries. Although they are quite different, it was discovered that the 3 of them are actually connected. Exploring this connection led to something that seemed really quite astounding. It looked as though the Holy Grail might have been found.
This was not something that had been expected. Hi, my name's Rory Duff. I used to be a geologist in the mining industry, but my research in the last 10 years has been in a relatively new subject called geobiology.
This is the study of how living things can be affected by the planet Earth itself.
So, finding what seemed to be the Grail that the Templars were looking for was really quite a surprise, especially as though it now seemed to be linked to a newly discovered scientific phenomenon. But before we get to that, and the implications that go with that, I want to first introduce you to these 3 previously unsolved mysteries from our past that eventually led to the discovery.
In 2014, I came across the first one inside a Knights Templar church in southern Spain, and it led me to think that it might just possibly provide a clue as to what a small select group of Knights Templar had been doing in that region. This mystery was about a legend that was encoded within some strange symbols that surrounded a filled-in window at the back of the church. The legend states that if the symbols were ever decoded, it would change the world for good. Investigating them and the legend led to finding the second mystery. This was at an almost unknown Templar chapel in southern France. What can be found there is some of the strangest art ever found inside a Christian place of prayer. High up on the ceiling were strange patterns that have never before been deciphered. In addition to this, and not long before visiting this French chapel, I came across the third mystery. It was found within a book on ancient Jewish alchemy that contained several drawings that have been called hieroglyphic figures. Looking into these figures in more detail, I came across 2 versions of them. Each version had the same drawings, but there were some subtle differences between them. In both cases, it appeared that there was no clear understanding as to what the true meanings were behind them. On closer investigation, it began to appear that one set of figures had been deliberately changed in order to hide the truth found within the original version. With this true meaning having now been uncovered, it led to seeing the connection between all 3 of these mysteries. It was this connection that then led to the discovery of the strategy that the Templars must have been using in order to find what has been more recently called the Knights Templar Holy Grail. What was really surprising was that this was very close to the same strategy that a group of researchers and myself had been following back in 2012 in order to try and find a very special location in southern Spain.
Back then, there was no talk of finding the Holy Grail. Our investigations had just shown that the area we were heading for was somewhere we expected to be quite unique in the terms of geobiology. What we expected to find there was a unique concentration of earth sound. These earth sounds are naturally occurring vibrations that have very low frequencies that are well below the bounds of normal hearing. Our researchers showed that these sounds are being generated from deep within the Earth. Our research shows that the solid inner core of the Earth could be the source of these sounds. This iron-nickel core seems to be behaving like a transducer. A transducer converts one type of energy into another. Typically, they are found in microphones and loudspeakers, changing sound into electricity and back again. In the case of the Earth's core, it's theoretically possible that gravitational energy and/or electrical energy is being converted into sound energy. What supports this idea is that it's known that iron and nickel acts as a mechanical filter. In other words, it only emits certain sound frequencies. The rest are filtered out, and this is exactly what we find on the surface of the Earth.
Sounds reach the surface of the Earth, and it is there that we detect them in high and low pressure zones. What we had also discovered was that these high pressure zones also made up patterns across the landscape as the zones crossed over each other. It was these intersections that were of interest to us, as some were larger and more intense than others. There is already good evidence to suggest that these places can either have a positive or negative effects on living things that spend too long in these high pressure areas, and it was this that was of interest to us.
What was intriguing was that the Templar strategy seemed to be to also look for these intersections, but they were not thinking of them in terms of low frequency sounds. They seem to have been looking for the intersections between ancient tracks. Their aim appeared to be first to find these tracks and then to follow them until they found the next intersection.
It seems that the intersection of these tracks were the places where the ancient European races used to hold their sacred ceremonies. Some of these locations are still known today as sacred places. Indeed, the Templars themselves put up some amazing cathedrals on a few of these intersections. Chartres, Reims, Amiens Cathedral were all built on top of these older sacred sites, and these were all found where old tracks crossed over each other. Very often at these sites, there were ancient mounds or collections of large stones.
These ancient tracks were not just basic ordinary tracks though. They were tracks that ran in extremely straight lines between these sacred intersections.
What was even more curious was that it was not just individuals or small groups of people who used these tracks. It appears that large migrations and mass pilgrimages over the centuries were known to take place along them. Whole communities would just up and move hundreds of miles from one sacred centre to go and live in another one. Something really important must have driven so many people to have done this.
Finding these paths running along straight lines has drawn some suspicion, and many scientists have in the past dismissed the idea of ancient straight tracks and paths. However, in our research into these earth sounds, we found something that might actually support the possibility that straight paths did actually exist.
The low-frequency sound waves we had been observing seemed to be resonating backwards and forwards within the earth as standing waves. On the surface, we found that the pattern they made was one of many straight lines that circled the earth. This also resulted in many intersections between them all, and it was this that led to the pattern of them all. Having already located several of these straight lines of sound energy, it was later on found that they were sited on exactly the same place and direction as the ancient sacred tracks. The intersections of these ancient tracks were also sited on the very same places where we had found the intersections of the sound waves. Not all sound lines had an associated ancient track, but all the tracks that we were aware of certainly did appear to be running along the same line and directions as these lines of sound. This may be just down to our ancestors not needing to have that many tracks to follow and only using the ones that led to their own known sacred sites. Many indeed may have been forgotten about over the centuries. Roman texts even suggest that the Celts themselves knew the tracks were there long before they were following them. This now looked as though our ancestors must have in some way sensed these low-frequency sounds and, for some reason, felt compelled to follow them and then to somehow sense that the intersections were places that were sacred to them. Why and how this was so is something that we're only just beginning to understand. What the team also now discovered was that the Templars appear to have been looking for not just any intersection between these paths. They appear to have been looking for just one in particular. One that was an intersection of a large number of these straight paths. They seem to have been looking for the greatest intersection of them all.
This was curiously very similar thinking to what we had concluded ourselves 2 years earlier. In our case though, we considered the possibility that a multitude of lines of sound energy could cross over in just one place. At this point, there are some major questions that need answering. Why were these Templars looking for ancient tracks in their sacred intersections? What connection does this have with the Holy Grail? And what indeed is this Holy Grail?
To add to that, we must also take into consideration that the Templars were doing all this searching over 50 years before the very first story about a Grail. In other words, what they were looking for was not even called the Grail by them. To begin to try and answer these questions, we have to first look in more detail at what the original knights were doing in Jerusalem, and what they are likely to have come across there, and how that connects with the little book of Jewish alchemy. Around the year 1118 AD, the original knights in Jerusalem were known to be quite poor. They are also known to have spent many years digging out tunnels beneath the Temple Mount. What they were looking for, and if they found anything, is something no one can be sure about. However, after about 9 years of these underground activities, they suddenly stopped and returned to Europe. It was there they formed the Knights Templar and began to grow in power and wealth. Some people in the past have suggested that they found a great treasure hidden underground, but lately scholars think this is unlikely. New light on what they may have found has now come from a little book on Jewish alchemy. This was a book whose source was said to have been a person living in Jerusalem nearly 130 years after the original knights were there. There was therefore no way these knights could have read this book. However, its contents say the information it contained had been passed down by word of mouth for over 1,000 years. This meant that the knights might well have heard about its contents. A good indication that they did come across similar information comes from some of the descriptions found in the book. Inside the book, there are exact details on where to find certain secrets hidden underground in the tunnels beneath Jerusalem. These precise instructions on where to dig out certain filled-in tunnels seem to be exactly where the knights had been digging their tunnels.
So that you, when the time comes, should be advised where our priests hid the most noble secrets. The same will be found at the entrance to the Holy of Holies towards the morning, where there's a vault 500 spans deep, through a narrow passage, and it's paved with broad, hewn, flat stones. When you come to the place where the Holy of Holies stood, and when you've found the spot and the entrance to it, toward morning on the right-hand side, clear it away, and there you'll find a stone which is 2 cubits deep. It's marked with a sign of fire. Lift it up. It lies 200 spans deep. If the passage is ruined, you must continue to clear it until you come to the place where you will find all the secrets which our fathers possessed, and will know how you should make use of them.
If the Templars were after the same secrets, then with some further examination of the book, we might perhaps find out what they were looking for. Without going into too much detail, the hieroglyphic figures have been shown to highlight the significance of sacred places and how to find them. It also hints that there are certain times of the year when you're more likely to find access to very valuable information and sacred knowledge.
It could have been this sacred knowledge that the Templars were really after. The reason the knights left Jerusalem is now thought to be because they discovered there was one place in Europe that was more sacred, more powerful than any other sacred place. It is thought that it was this place that a small group of knights really wanted to find.
In addition to that, though, the book had one more piece of information. The book itself says that it contained the secrets of the universe. We'll return to the potential significance of this slightly later on. The knights who returned from Jerusalem then seemed to pursue their quest of looking for these sacred sites by following these ancient tracks and their intersections, and it seems that when they did find powerful intersections, they then built amazing cathedrals on them.
Their quest, though, was not called the quest for the Holy Grail. To these particular Templars, who were now much more spiritually orientated, it was more likely they were looking for some kind of divine spirit. This was possibly the same kind of thing that the ancient Jews called the Shekinah and the Muslims called the Sakinah. If that was the case, it meant that what they were looking for was quite intangible, something you couldn't even touch. We have to now ask, how could that possibly relate to the concept of the Holy Grail?
To start to look into this, we have to try and find out how the Grail name became connected to the Templars and their quest. The original story about a Grail was written by Chrétien de Troyes around 1180 to 1190 AD. Troyes, a town in northeast France, was the same place that the Templar Order was formed many years earlier, and it is likely that Chrétien was well aware of the Templars and their work, and possibly their spiritual aims. In Chrétien's story, the Grail was just described as a dish. One of the French words for a dish at the time was a grail. It was not special, and it had no magical powers. The only thing in the story that could be thought of as special anyway was that the dish carried a holy wafer. The wafer, which was likely to be a communion wafer, was all that seemed to be keeping the Fisher King's father alive. Several stories were written after the initial one, and each one seemed to be attempting to persuade their audience that the Grail was now not actually a dish at all, but something else. For example, one story changes the original dish into a cup that has connections with Jesus, and another later story, the Grail is called a sacred stone. It was almost as though there were several different interest groups around at the time who were each wanted to win people over into thinking that their story was the only true story. In attempting to do this, it seems that these stories were being made more and more attractive to their listeners, with the Grail being given added magical powers. Typically these powers were to do with healing, manifestation, eternal nourishment, and even rejuvenation. These additions would have had much appeal and would have certainly made a particular story much more popular. The fact that we have so many different versions of the Grail with many different powers only adds to the confusion as to what the Grail really is.
One story in particular, though, which came out shortly after the original one, may provide us with an answer to our questions. This one is called Pelesphos, the higher history of the Holy Grail. In this story, the Grail is said to exist in 5 different forms, and that its shape changes between them all, but that the last shape is that of a cup, and this is suspended in mid-air. Other writers later on say that the other shapes were that of a spear, a sword, a dish, and a cauldron.
It goes on to say that to most people, these shapes were completely invisible. The story is said to have been written by a Cistercian monk, and the story seems to have slightly more of a spiritual slant to it than perhaps other stories have. The Cistercians had a good connection with the Templars. Indeed, one of the co-founders of the Templars was Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard had spent many years in his youth as one of their monks. This means it is possible that the writer of Pelesphos may have known something about what one small group of Templars had been discovering, who wanted to write his version of the Grail story that incorporated knowledge of what these Templars had been looking for. The description of this story, the higher history of the Grail, may have been an attempt to refer back to a time before Christian's original story to show the true history of the legend behind the Grail. Indeed, the word higher may even be referring to a more spiritual aspect of the Templars' searching. This is apparent by the fact that the story says the Grail could only be seen by someone who is truly holy. It is all these descriptions that now takes us to the small chapel at Monceau in the south of France. The chapel is also found on an intersection of the old straight tracks and sound lines, so it too was an ancient sacred site well before the Templars got there. As was mentioned earlier, on the ceiling is some of the strangest religious art ever found in one place. You can see a variety of flower of life type patterns and also ones that are circular drawings with all sorts of shapes in the middle. Up until now, no one has come up with an explanation or a meaning to all the drawings.
In 2015, I took photos of all the symbols and found that the round ones could be categorized into 5 different groups of shapes and patterns. All of them had 2 outer rings within which there were several other different patterns or symbols.
Intriguingly, there was also a cup or grail-like symbol, but there were also symbols that looked as though they could represent vortex shapes and torus shapes. It looked as though all the circular signs and drawings were really just 2-dimensional representation of one changing 3-dimensional shape. This was immediately of interest to us, as we were aware of certain 3-dimensional shapes that are made by intersecting sound waves. At first glance, it looked as though these sound shapes might be similar to the ones being represented as 2-dimensional symbols on the chapel ceiling. In one place on the ceiling, a selection of these drawings are displayed in what looks like a sequence of shapes, and it was this that allowed a connection to be made with the descriptions of the Holy Grail in the story called Pelesphos, the higher history of the Grail. This was a story that mentions that the Grail was the shape of a spear, then a sword, a cup, a dish, and finally a cauldron. If this was right, the sequence of the 2-dimensional shapes on the ceiling of the chapel could possibly be trying to symbolize these same changing 3-dimensional shapes that the Cistercian writer wanted to later call the Grail.
It is perhaps not immediately obvious that the ceiling drawings are representations of these objects. However, we have to consider 2 things. Firstly, that these are dynamic and constantly changing shapes, which means that no single shape lasts long at all. Secondly, we have to consider the viewing angle. If these shapes are connected in any way to the shapes that sound energies can make, then these shapes appear to have been drawn from the perspective of being directly above the changing 3-dimensional shape. You can perhaps imagine that the 2 outer circular rings are like a cross-section of a thick vertical water pipe, and that it would be within this pipe that we see the changing shapes. In other words, it would be like being above an empty upturned pipe and looking down into it like that, which is quite strange when you consider that inside the chapel you're actually below and looking up at the ceiling at the drawings in the first place.
We can take the vortex shape as an example to explain this. The pipe itself, with its two circular rings creating an annular shape, would be representing some sort of containment field. In nature, for a vortex to form and grow in size, it also needs some form of circular containment area. Inside this field, shown by the double rings, we can see the spiral arms coming out from the center. It is supposed that these are the spiral arms of a vortex. Within water or air, a natural vortex will have high pressure areas that look like arms driving the spinning motion.
When sound waves are directed toward each other under certain conditions, vortexes like this can also form. If a vortex shape was being represented this way on the ceiling, it would be as though we were physically above the vortex and looking right down on top of it. To them, it could have been mirroring an aspect of one of their newly acquired ways of thinking, Hermeticism. This ancient philosophy of the Greek Hermes Trismegistus had a saying, as above, so below, and the Templars could have been having some fun with this here. As the phrase was a viewpoint they would have agreed with, they would have enjoyed representing their images in a way that was a deliberate reversal, from below as above perhaps.
The other symbols shown on the ceiling then represent the shapes before the vortex and the ones that come after. All this, though, still leaves an even bigger question as to just what exactly this version of the Templar Grail actually is. It is here we can return to the little book of Jewish alchemy for a possible answer and look again at the statement it makes about containing the secrets of the universe. If this, however, is in any way true, and the symbols within it are indicative of sound, then it might actually begin to offer us a potential explanation for something that could be natural and powerful as well as invisible. What we know from scientists is that everything in the universe at its smallest scale is ultimately composed of energy, an energy that is in a constant state of vibration. If this little book is right, then this vibrating energy could well be connected to a form of universal sound energy. In other words, it's an energy based on sound that is the foundation of everything. Just why this would be significant to the Templars and the people before them who thought that these intersections were important sacred places still needs to be looked at much more closely. So, if what the Templars were looking for were ancient sacred sites, we have to ask why they might have wanted to find these things. For possible answers to this, we can turn to the Templar window at Caravaggio de la Cruz and learn more from a completely new interpretation of its hidden message. As was mentioned earlier, one of the founders of the Templar Knights was Bernard of Clairvaux. In Bernard's early life as a Cistercian monk, he would have become aware of their customs and ways. This would have included their secret ways of communication. The research team found that 4 of the symbols around the Templar window looked very similar to those used in a Cistercian number cipher. The cipher, though, used to superimpose the symbols for numbers all around one central vertical line. Around the window, it looked as though they'd been individually separated to match and fit in with the other symbols. With the understanding that ciphers can slowly evolve over time, this enabled the team to establish a likely date for when the window was filled in and for when the coded message was put up. The central vertical line would now have been representing 1000. The vertical line with the diagonal line going up from the bottom now represented 300. And the 1 and the 3 are vertical lines again with an added short line at the top. The date that emerged was 1313 AD, which was very soon after the Templar Order was disbanded by the Pope. At that time, it seems that the Templars had wanted to leave an important message to their followers.
To do that, though, they'd have to explain to the Roman Church and the local congregation why they were putting these symbols up around the window, and also what they meant. So if they'd wanted to put up a secret message, they'd had to disguise it with an open one that was acceptable to everyone.
This meant that some of the key symbols would have needed to have a double meaning, an open and more obvious one, and then a secret one. If you look at the center of the window, at the shapes with the flowers behind the glass, we find that they've been made to look like 4 angels flying around the center. The reason for this seems to be twofold. Firstly, it represents one of the miracles that Caravaggio was known for. Several angels were said to have flown down from heaven with a piece of the true cross, which was needed for a ceremony to convert a Moorish king over to Christianity. This was how the town of Caravaca became Caravaca of the Cross, or in Spanish, Caravaca de la Cruz, and why the cross sign here has two horizontal strips across the upright rather than one. The shapes in the middle of the window were purposely designed to look like these flying angels, and their basic shape can now be found as a particular symbol around the edge. The second reason for the angel shape in the glass is that the symbol seems to have been an important part of the hidden message, as it's repeated 4 times. Its inclusion was obviously critical. To do this, it appears they decided to make the angel shapes in the middle look closely like this symbol. To convince people it was an angel symbol, they had the glass shapes held in place with a circle and semicircle support structure, which form the head and the shoulders of the flying angel. This symbol could now be seen to represent an angel in the open message, and the full meaning of the open message can now be seen as an account of the miracle of the angels bringing down a fragment of the true cross from the heavens. Several of the other signs could be seen to represent the planets and the stars, the moon and the sun.
This now left the Templars able to use this same symbol for their more important hidden meaning, which is part of a secret message for their followers. As with other symbols around the window, some had to be slightly adapted in order to simplify and shorten them so the hidden message could be fitted in within the open one. The symbol used for the angel too had to be slightly shortened to fit in as well.
The full symbol is thought to have been one that was used later, called the Monas Hieroglyphica. The symbol was said to have become well known due to an English mathematician from the 16th century called John Dee. Dee is thought to have come across it in some early Rosicrucian writings. These in turn have been said to have had their origins in early Hebrew and ancient Egyptian ways of thinking. It is thought that these Templars would have probably come across this same symbol from these same early sources. The Monas symbol openly looks as though it's supposed to represent several planets all coming together in harmony or alignment. Indeed, its meaning is said to refer to a type of cosmic unity. The shortened version of this symbol can now be found in 4 positions around the circular window. In the original Monas symbol, the half circle and the full circle represented the moon and the sun. Side by side, they give the impression they are coming together in cosmic alignment.
Ordinarily, this would make it look like a coming eclipse, but to have 4 signs for an eclipse around the window doesn't make much sense, and it's unlikely that a short secret message would repeatedly refer to an eclipse 4 times.
However, what the researchers have found by looking at ancient Egyptian and Old Hermetic writings is that this symbol is thought to have a much deeper meaning than just a physical cosmic unity between the sun and the moon. This more ancient meaning is one that refers to a kind of unity that is said to be able to occur between ourselves and the universe.
This was much more like a meditative or prayer-like connection between our consciousness and the world around us. This idea of cosmic unity now seems very similar to the Templar goal of reaching a higher level of spiritual harmony with the universe.
Interpretations of other symbols now led us to realize that these 4 symbols were actually referring to 4 occasions in a year when it appears that this deep inner cosmic unity can more easily occur. Occasions when it seemed a person could in some way be in harmony with the sounds from the earth, and perhaps too of the universe. What the shapes at Monzón and the symbols at Caravaca and the Little Book of Alchemy seem to be telling us is it is only on these 4 days each year that the dynamic Grail-like shapes of invisible sound energy form at these sacred intersections.
Some of you may at this stage be assuming that these 4 days would fall on the days of the equinoxes and the solstices. Knowledge of the Templars would certainly seem to support this idea, but curiously it's not the case. The 4 days indeed are related closely to the timing of these solar days, but with further investigations, these 4 occasions now seem to be falling on the same days as the true Hebrew holy days.
What may be happening on these occasions, at these sacred sites, is that our body can be made to resonate in harmony with the higher harmonics of the low-frequency sound energies. This resonance is likely to be greatly enhanced through chanting and playing musical instruments that are also on the right harmonic frequency. The overall effect may well then lead on to what some people might call enlightenment, and the overall effect may well be highly beneficial to us. The uppermost symbol of the window is the zigzag symbol. Although this is commonly interpreted as an Egyptian symbol for water, it is here next to what is assumed to be a symbol for the sun. Scientists now think that several Egyptian hieroglyphs, like this water sign, actually have different meanings depending on how they're pronounced. Investigations led to the zigzag symbol being known as a symbol as rays from the sun. These are not ordinary waves though, they are known as rays that manifest matter. The symbol's full interpretation indicates that this was a place where the Templars considered that whatever they needed in their life could be manifested if they prayed and meditated for it to come about. This could be another reason why this small group of Templars was searching for these sites. The idea of manifestation at sacred sites is not actually new though. At the city of Bath in England there are some famous hot springs. When the Romans were there, they used to write their wishes and curses down on lead tablets and then throw them into the waters in order for them to come true. The locals before the Romans were there also knew the place to be a sacred site where this kind of manifestation could come true. They would have held ceremonies like this there over many centuries, and one might think that if it had not worked to some degree, the practice would have ceased much earlier. Hot springs in Bath are also found on an intersection of sound lines.
Praying or meditating for something to come about is not just something that happens with religious and spiritual organizations. We also find it happening in a more business-oriented environment. But here it's known by another name completely. It's called the law of attraction. Sometimes it's called the secret, and it's practiced all around the world.
Many people who do this can also point to the success it has given them. It all revolves around the concept of asking, believing, and then receiving. How this manifestation actually happens, we may not yet fully understand, but it now seems that the Templars and the ancient priests before them thought that if you practiced this same art of manifestation at certain sacred sites, at certain times of the year, you would have a much greater chance of success. At these places and on the right days, the correct manifestation process now seems to be a combination of prayer and meditation, along with an element of the law of attraction. With the many sacred sites that these Templars had come across, it now appears that a sound energy formation could well be forming 4 times a year at every single one of them. At each sacred intersection of straight tracks, they would have presumably checked to see if their Templar Grail formed here. If it was not the one they were looking for, they would have carried on looking. At some intersections, like at Chartres in France, they must have felt some supremely powerful energy formation that they felt was worthy of building a great cathedral. This, though, was not enough for some of the Templars, and a few of them seemed to still want to find the greatest sacred intersection of them all. This must have been something that had legendary status in those early times, where knowledge would have been handed down by word of mouth over many centuries. It had probably been the intention of the Templars to first find this most powerful sacred site, and then to go on and build a beautiful cathedral in that place, just like they did at several other sites. To the Templars, though, who would have not had the benefit of accurate maps as we have today, it would have meant physically travelling along the individual paths in order to find the next intersection. It would only have been a matter of time before the Templars would eventually found this major intersection. Unfortunately for them, it does not appear that the Templars ever got to find their special place. The most likely reason for this we just don't have the time to go into in this documentary. We have, however, managed to achieve what the Templars seem to have originally set out to do. In 2012, our research had shown that there were several linear concentrations of sound running across Europe, and it did not take us long to find where this major intersection was located. With nothing visible on the map at that location, we decided to travel over to Spain to find out where it was locally and to do some further investigations. What we saw when we got there was the beginnings of a fairly unknown archaeological dig. This turned out to be no ordinary dig though.
The hill behind me is the site of one of Europe's largest Bronze Age cities. It's a place called La Bastida here in southeast Spain near to Totana.
It was also a place that had local archaeologists really puzzled. What had puzzled them was that this site was not next to a river, nor was it near to the sea, and it was not even on the highest ground in the area. There were plenty of other high places that would have been much easier to defend, for example. In fact, all the reasons you might expect to find associated with being a good location for a large Bronze Age city seemed to be missing. But the place was clearly very important to these people, as they built large fortified walls around the base of the hill in order to protect themselves. What was also perhaps being protected was what the archaeologists thought they had found at the very top of the hill. This place appears to have been somewhere that was very sacred to the inhabitants of this city. With evidence from ancient tools that have been found there, it seems that over 4,000 years ago, several hundred people left their homes and migrated over 2,000 miles to the west, possibly on a pilgrimage, and then decided to settle on this small hill. It also seems to have been a popular place as they and their ancestors then lived there for over 800 years.
We now think we know the reason why. The sacred site at the top of the hill appears to be in the same type of place that the Knights Templars had been searching for. According to their strategy of looking for the sacred intersections, the top of the hill was often the location of a powerful sacred place. These were places that they probably first learnt about back in the tunnels beneath Jerusalem. They probably also expected their most powerful intersection, their most sacred place, to also be found on top of a hill.
This was somewhere that they thought that manifestation, healing, nourishment and spiritual enlightenment could all be more easily obtained through prayer and meditation. It seems that because of this particular location, some form of entirely natural power occurs that helps their minds reach some kind of universal cosmic unity. If this was the case, then it was a good chance that what was found at the Monceau Chapel, which was being represented on the ceiling, would also be found here too. The difference being, though, this particular temporal grail would now be a much stronger and much more powerful grail than all the others. Perhaps even, according to the writer of Palesmaus, being worthy of the title, the Holy Grail.
What is now really interesting is that this kind of cosmic unity experience seems to be connected in some way to sound. If this is correct, it would mean that further investigations into this could prove to be potentially very rewarding. By standing in the middle of an intersection of these low frequency sound waves, we have to wonder just what kind of physiological and mental effects this sound bath might have on someone. This is just one of the things that we're now studying in geobiology, but there's clearly room for other more technological sciences to investigate this area as well.
We already know how much music and sound can influence us in both positive and negative ways, so we can only begin to guess at what sort of things could happen when within this intersection of sound. This connection to sound might also explain why singing, chanting and playing music at these places and in many others is so compelling for some people.
Living on top of these low frequency sound lines are also known to produce difficulties. They seem to accentuate one's natural emotions. If you feel slightly depressed, you'll feel very, very depressed. If you feel slightly happy, you'll feel very, very happy. Just imagine now if you could hear that sound. You could be living on a nice harmonic sound, or alternatively, you could be living on a sound that you really couldn't stand. Both will affect you, but in different ways. The problem is there are different sounds with different frequencies, and we're all individually affected in different ways.
Geobiologists today are learning more and more about these earth sounds and fortunately now have several ways they can help. The resonance that can be generated both within a person and within buildings like the great cathedrals now seem to be greatly enhanced by the harmonics of these low frequency earth sounds at certain times of the year.
We're only just beginning to learn what this can lead to. This all might seem quite pleasing for some scientists to hear about, but possibly quite troubling initially for some spiritual people to come to terms with. As was said earlier though, this need not be the case. Although there's a good working theory behind it, we still need to learn more about these standing sound waves and how they're being sustained. New theories are beginning to explain the connection between sound energy and light energy, and at least one of these seemed to have plenty of room for a divine-like origin for sound. The phrase, "in the beginning was the word," may yet be proved to be most valid.
With regards to the Grail legend though, it appears that at least what the Templars were looking for has been found, and that we now have a good idea of what it is and why they were looking for it. It may not be the Grail that Chrétien de Troyes wrote about, but it seems to be part of a legend that began in the Bronze Age that got attached to the Grail legends. This Bronze Age legend appears to have powers of manifestation, healing, rejuvenation, and spiritual enlightenment, and each one of these we can now find in the later Grail stories. It is perhaps because of these powers that the Temple of Grail holds such promise for all of us. Finally, we have to ask if the legend of the message around the window of Caravaggio de la Cruz is truly something that would change the world for good.
Although we've not been able to cover a full interpretation of these symbols in this documentary, the main implications behind the message is that meditation or prayer at certain sacred places on 4 specific times in the year will greatly assist in helping someone reach spiritual enlightenment. With many thousands of people doing this on the same holy day all around the world, we can only imagine the beneficial consequences for mankind. The concept of a critical threshold combined with manifestation might well mean that we can also change the world for good.
This documentary has only been able to touch on a few of the subjects it mentions. We just hope that it's been of interest to you up to this point and that you're happy you spent time watching it. If you'd like further information or would like to actively do more, please go to the website address shown below. There are seminars and lectures that are being held that you might like to attend as well. There is also a book called Grail Found that goes into much greater detail in these areas and many more. The book is currently available via links on the website. The World Harmony Trust's charity has also been set up to raise funds to build a multi-faith centre in southern Spain on one of these major sound lines. If anyone is interested in this project, please go to the WH website as well.